Hello everyone! This week in Biology 1 we're going to be talking about plants. Plants will be our primary focus for this week. What I have shown here on the screen is just a reminder about the organization of living things. So we've got two major categories, prokaryotes and eukaryotes, and that header is defining whether or not the cells have organelles inside, whether they have membrane-bound structures. So last week we were focused in on the prokaryotes. Prokaryotes are microscopic for the most part, and so we talked about bacteria and archaea last time. This week we're going to be more focused on eukaryotes, so cells that do have organelles inside. And if you look at these four categories of eukaryotes, the very familiar animals, and then beneath that we have the protists. We've already talked about protists. They were also microscopic, so those were covered in chapter 15. Today what we're going to be heading into are these other two categories of eukaryotes, the plants and the fungi. So we're going to start with the plants. There are four major types of plants. Let me just list out the names for us here. We're going to be going through each of these. I'll have a separate video for each one. First up, we've got the bryophytes. Bryophytes include familiar things like mosses, so relatively simple plants. Bryophytes, and then we'll talk about ferns. And then after that, we'll head into the gymnosperms. A lot of trees are gymnosperms. And then the last one will be the angiosperms. Angiosperms are the flowering plants. So not all plants produce flowers, but the ones that do are called angiosperms. So we will go ahead and get started, first off, with the bryophytes. Okay, bryophytes. Bryophytes are categorized by being non-vascular, so they don't have a normal vasculature that allows them to have circulation going on through the plant body. That just doesn't exist. So these are called non-vascular plants. That would be the informal way to refer to them, non-vascular, but very descriptive way to refer to them, non-vascular plants. And these include, I already mentioned, includes the mosses. Also the liverworts and the hornworts are in this category too. Liverworts and hornworts. And in addition to being non-vascular, these plants also do not have true roots or leaves. They don't have those familiar plant structures. So we're going to say they lack true roots and leaves. They also lack a material called lignin. Lignin, if lignin were present, what it would be doing is hardening the cell walls. It's a wall hardening material. Wall hardening material. And the bryophytes don't have it. So since they don't have that, it's not possible for them to get very tall. They start to grow upwards a little bit, and then since their cell walls are not very rigid, they just kind of flop over. So they don't get very tall because of this fact. Don't get very tall, right? Think of all the mosses you've ever seen. They're always very short and close to the ground. Don't get very tall. Okay, now here's an interesting thing about plants. You might not know this, or maybe you do, but this is something that is a surprise to a lot of folks. The bryophytes and a lot of plants, they actually have male and female forms, male and female plants. Same is true here for the mosses. They have male and female forms or plants. And literally what they do is produce sperm and egg. So it's the gamete cells will be produced. Different types of gametes will be produced by the different genders of plants. So these produce sperm and eggs. Okay. respectively. Let me add that in. So the male plants produce sperm, the female plants produce eggs. respectively. Okay. All right, so the thing that is particularly important for bryophytes is that they have access to water. They have to live in watery conditions. And the reason for that is because how is the plant going to reproduce? So if you have a separate female plant and a separate male plant, how does the sperm get to where the egg is at? It actually has to be able to swim through the water. So the bryophytes need water in order to reproduce. And that is because the sperm has to be able to swim to the egg, and that egg is located in the female plant. Okay, and then the other reason, let's come back up here. They need water to, number one, reproduce. Number two, the other reason that they need water is because they don't have the normal vasculature, right? So there's no way to conduct water up through the plant body. Instead, it's just, the water just has to sort of be able to seep up into the plant, and that's not gonna work if the plant is very tall. And so they have to just kind of be swimming in a watery surroundings. So number two, they need water because they don't have any vasculature, no vascular tissue to carry water up into the plant. Now, we're going to take an aside for just a moment. So we need to talk about sort of the general life cycle for plants. Regardless of which of these four categories of plants we're in, they all have this sort of general life cycle in common. And they display what's called an alternation of generations. We'll see what that means in just a second. So let's get some of this down. Plant life cycles exhibit what's called an alternation of generations. Alternation of generations. Okay, and what they're alternating between are two different plant forms. They alternate between what's called a gametophyte. Gametophytes produce gametes, that's why they're named as such. Gametophytes produce gametes. Gametes that will unite to form, gametes that will unite to form a zygote. And the other form is called a sporophyte. Sporophytes produce spores. Sporophytes. These produce spores that ultimately grow up into a gametophyte form. So a spore grows up, goes through many rounds of mitosis, and it grows up to be a gametophyte plant. Okay, so let's draw, we can draw this out, draw a representation of this alternation of generations. Let's start with, I'm going to use two different colors. We'll color code as we go through this chapter. Let me just let's start with red. Okay, so yeah, what we're gonna do is start over here on the right hand side. Let's start with the gametes. That kind of is a familiar starting place. It sort of seems like the beginning. Let's start with gametes. So gametes, this is the word that refers to sperm cells and egg cells as reproductive cells. Sperm and eggs. And if you think back, sperm and eggs, are they diploid or are they haploid? You can think back to what we learned about in cell division. Gametes are usually formed by meiosis, according to what we've learned previously, and that results in a reduction in the number of chromosomes in the cell, so they end up being haploid. So I'm just going to put here, I'm going to put lowercase n, that's just representing the fact that these are haploid cells. Okay, so what would happen in this life cycle is the gametes would fuse together, fertilization would take place, so fertilization occurs, and then after fertilization what we end up with is a zygote. It's just the name for a fertilized egg. It's a zygote, which is now diploid. A sperm has fused with an egg, so now it is 2N. Okay, that zygote would undergo many rounds of mitosis, just like we do, many rounds of mitosis in order to grow up into an adult form. And the adult form is called a sporophyte. So I'm going to say mitosis takes place, and what we end up with is a sporophyte plant. Sporophytes are still diploid, they're still 2N. Okay, that sporophyte would go through meiosis. Okay, so meiosis will take place inside of this plant body. Meiosis, and then I'm going to switch back to red after meiosis. What meiosis produces is a spore. So we start with a sporophyte plant, undergoes meiosis, and it produces spores. Spores are single N. Okay, so the process of meiosis reduces the number of chromosomes. Now we have haploid spores. Let's finish out the cycle here. The spores would undergo mitosis, so normal cell division, mitosis. And when they are grown up in the adult form, this plant would be called a gametophyte. Gametophyte, which is haploid as well. Okay, so here's the part that gets a little bit strange, at least up front it'll seem a little bit strange. We have this adult gametophyte plant, and in order to produce gametes, all it's going to do is undergo mitosis. And that should feel kind of strange. This plant is doing mitosis in order to produce gametes. That's not fitting with what we've learned before. The reason for this is because the adult plant, the gametophyte, it's already haploid, right? So there's no way to reduce the number of chromosomes even more. So it just undergoes normal cell division by mitosis in order to produce gametes. Okay, so that's the plant life cycle, alternation of generations. It's alternating between the sporophyte form down here, I'm going to circle this in blue, and the gametophyte form up here. I'm going to circle this in red. So as I go through these categories of plants, I'm going to be consistent with these colors. I'm going to use blue to represent sporophyte plants and red to represent gametophyte plants. Let's come back to the bryophytes for just a minute. So the bryophytes, let's see how this applies for them. For the bryophytes, when you look at a bryophyte, think of moss. When you look at moss, for bryophytes, when we look at the moss plant, the short little green moss plant, the main plant body that we're looking at, that is the gametophyte form. The gametophyte is the larger, more obvious form of gametophyte. Is the larger, more obvious plant. And so if we had to draw a picture to represent this, don't judge my drawing, we're just going to try and get some ideas across here. So here's the ground. Let me see here. Okay, so we're going to do sporophytes in blue, gametophytes in red. So I'm going to grab some red, and I'm just going to try and draw sort of a side view of a little moss plant. So looks something like this. It's pretty short, pretty close to the ground. It's got these little, they look like leaves, though they're not really leaves. And this main plant body is called a gametophyte. Gametophytes are haploid, so I'll just put this as a reminder, single N. And then the sporophyte, it's interesting. So let me come back up to our life cycle here. Okay, so gametophyte plant, it's going to produce gametes, and once those fuse together, grows into a sporophyte. The sporophyte plant is actually going to be stacked on top. So fertilization would happen right here inside of this gametophyte plant, and then the sporophyte plant will just grow out the top. So I'm going to switch to blue, and we're just going to draw in a stalk and sort of a little bulge at the end. This whole thing, this is the sporophyte plant right here at the end. This is where spores would be produced. So this is the sporophyte, and it is diploid, 2N. So this whole thing is kind of two plants in one. You'll only see this at certain times of the year. So sometimes when you go out and you look at mosses, if you have mosses growing around your house or something, sometimes you'll just see the gametophyte. Other times you'll see stalks sticking up, and that's the sporophyte plant right there with it.